This is this section number 2 of organizing data, that is organizing qualitative data. Okay, let's start with the definitions. A frequency distribution of a qualitative data is a listing of distinct values and their frequencies. A frequency distribution of qualitative data is a listing of the distinct values and their frequencies. There is a procedure to construct a frequency distribution of qualitative data. Let's see how we can do that. We know that qualitative variables are the variables with non-numerical values. In this frequency distribution, what we basically do is creating a table that gives the number of times each distinct values occurs. That is called the frequency or the count of each distinct values. There are several steps that we can follow when constructing a frequency distribution of qualitative data. The step 1 is list the distinct values of the observations in the dataset in the first column of the table. And the second step is, for each observation, place a tally mark in the second column of the table in the row of the appropriate distinct value. And the final step is count the tallies for each distinct values and record the totals in third column of the table. I know this procedure looks a little bit complicated, but once we go through an example in the next slide, you will get to know that it's very easy to build a frequency distribution. Okay, in this example we have the political party affiliation in the students of introductory statistics data. There are several data of each student's preference of a political party, and I think there are 40 observations, and we are going to get the frequency distribution of these 40 observations. Okay. The first step is to create this table. That is, the first column is party, the variable values that we have in this variable, in the qualitative variables. There is other, Republican and Democratic. And then the second column is the column that we put the tally marks. And the third column is the frequency distribution column. Okay, it's very easy to identify how many other values in this variable. Okay, let's see how we can do that. First of all, we need to go through the data set. There are several other values. We need to go through the data set each one by one, and then when we found other as a data, then we put a tally mark here like this. Second one, third one, fourth one, and then a cross sign to make it has 5, and then 6, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, that's all. So altogether there are 9 observation of other value other. Okay, so we put 9 as the frequency. Okay, and then similarly we can repeat the things for Republican and Democratic. For Republican we have 18 observations. For Democratic we have 13 observations. Altogether the observations are 40. Number of observations that we have in our data set. Okay. Now let's move to the next part of this section, that is the relative frequency distribution of qualitative data. Okay. By the definition, the relative frequency distribution of qualitative data is a listing of the distinct values and their relative frequencies. And the relative frequency can be calculated by frequency divided by the total number of observations. Let's see how can we calculate the relative frequency for our data set in the example. Okay. To construct a relative frequency distribution of qualitative data, there is again a procedure. Yeah, there are two steps that we need to construct a relative frequency distribution column. Step 1 is to obtain a frequency distribution of the data. As we did in the previous example, we already obtained a frequency distribution of the data. So the next step is divide each frequency by the total number of observations. Now, as we already have the frequency column in the table, we need to add a new column, that is the relative frequency. For example, if we want to calculate the relative frequency for other value, take the frequency value as the numerator and then divide it by the total number of observations. By that, you can generate the relative frequency of other, that is 0.225. And similarly, we can get the relative frequency of Democratic and Republican as well. For Democratic, it's 13 divided by 40. For Republican, it's 18 divided by 40. And altogether, the summation of the relative frequency column should equal to 1. Okay? I think it's not that difficult, right? To get the relative frequency column. Now, as we know how to create the relative frequency, now we can create a pie chart. That is a graphical representation of data, qualitative data. We can create a pie chart because we already created the relative frequencies of each values of the variable, each values of the qualitative variable that we have. By the definition, pie chart is a disk divided into wedged shaped pieces proportional to the relative frequencies of the qualitative data. And to construct a pie chart, there are 3 steps. The first step is to obtain the relative frequency distribution of the data, as we did in the previous example. We already obtained a relative frequency distribution of the data. And then the second step is to divide the disk into wedged shaped pieces proportional to the relative frequencies. And finally, label the slices with distinct values and their relative frequencies. Okay, those 3 are the 3 steps that we need to follow to construct a pie chart. As we already have the relative frequency data, we need to get the percentage proportion using the relative frequency values we obtained for each party. This is how we can get that. For an example, if we want to get the percentage proportion of other party, we should multiply the relative frequency value of other party with 100%. Then we will get the percentage proportion, that is 22.5%. Let's call it as 23%. And for Democratic, it's 32%, and for Republican, it's 45%. Altogether, the summation of the percentage proportion column is also should be 100%. And then we can create the pie chart by dividing the circle according to the percentage values, like this. It's a nice graphical representation of qualitative data. Okay. Now let's move to the next section, that is the bar charts. Creating bar charts, that's another graphical representation of qualitative data. It's also a graphical representation that we are doing using the relative frequency. By the definition, The bar chart displays the distinct values of the qualitative data on a horizontal axis and the relative frequencies or percents of those values in a vertical axis. The relative frequency of each distinct value is represented by a vertical bar whose height is equal to the relative frequency of that value. The bars should be positioned so that they do not touch each other. That is a lengthy definition, but you will get to know how to do it once we go through the example. To construct a bar chart, there are 4 steps that you should follow. The first one is obtain a relative frequency distribution of the data, as we already did in our example. We already have that column. And then the second step is to draw a horizontal axis on which to place the bars and a vertical axis on which to display the relative frequencies. Those are the 2 axes that we are going to draw, the horizontal one and the vertical one. And next, for each distinct value, construct a vertical bar whose height equals to the relative frequency of that value. For each distinct value, we should construct a vertical bar whose height equals to the relative frequency of that value. And finally, the fourth step, label the bars with distinct values, the horizontal axis with the names of the variable, and the vertical axis with the relative frequency. Those are the 4 steps that we should follow to construct a bar chart. Now let's move to our example and see how we can create a bar chart for our dataset. Okay, we already have this relative frequency column for each variable, for each name of the variable. We can draw the bars of each party in our bar chart like this. It's very easy. You have names of the variable in the horizontal axis and the relative frequency in the vertical axis, and for each name of the variable you have a vertical bar that goes up to its relative frequency. Yeah, it's simple as that. And that's the end of the second section, and see you guys in the next section. Thank you.